Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Spirit Reports of Life After Life by Allan Kardec. We're continuing our weekly study on the cases, the second half of Heaven and Hell, where Allan Kardec gifts us with this immortal treasure of spirit reports. These are spirits who reporting back to us of what their experiences are like in the spirit world. And the fantastic part is also that Allan Kardec gives us a bigger picture. He shows us and tells us what their lives were like in the previous or even before previous incarnation. So we're getting the bigger picture and we're learning of what to do, how we can prepare ourselves in our lifetime starting today for a better discarnation process and a better experience in the spirit world. And we're also learning from those spirits who've omitted some of their duties of how we can do it better. Right now, we're in the last category, and that is called the Earthly Expiations. Now, the Earthly Expiations, as we can gather, are usually spirits who've not done so super well in their lifetime during their incarnation. So they're teaching us a lot of lessons of what not to do. But by learning what not to do, we know what to do. So we can't lose. It's a fantastic opportunity for study. So welcome, dear friends. Nora Brazil, lovely friend. Thank you for being here. And before we can start, let us do a little prayer. So we become more opening our hearts and minds, connecting consciously with God, imagining a mirror that is installed in front of our minds and in front of our hearts. And we're turning it towards God and Jesus, Mother Mary, all the spirits on high, as spirit doctors, the spirit mentors, and our own mentors, the mentors of Kardec Radio, the mentors of this group. And as we are pointing our mirrors towards those beautiful spirits on high and God and Jesus and Mother Mary, we're reflecting back their wisdom, their beauty, their knowledge, their perfection, their light, their love. And we're feeling the energy embracing us warmly. We're feeling the love, and the love feels good. And we ask, dear spirits, dear Jesus, dear God, that we're open tonight to assimilate the lesson that is coming through as a gift from the Spirit who is reporting back tonight, so we may learn and remind ourselves of certain lessons that are important for us for a successful incarnation. And with this, we begin our study tonight, and so be it. Thank you. Thank you so much, dear friends. I see more people, so please do say hi so we can make this a intercontinental classroom. We can actually connect. So we're good today. We're going to Heaven and Hell, and we are going to study the story of a servant. If you'd like to follow along, since we're not going to read the whole entire story, but we're going to do quite a bit of reading today because it's fairly short and it's an important study. You can find him on page 513, The Story of a Servant. In a family of the upper nobility, there was a young servant whose intelligent and fine features surprised us with their air of distinction. So this upper nobility family who had him as a servant is also later referred to as Mr. G, and Mr. G was his master. One could detect nothing base about the servant from his aspects. His eagerness to serve his masters displayed none of the servility common to those in his position. When we returned to visit this family the following year, we were told he had gone to spend a few days in his hometown and had passed away while there. So they went to visit him, and he had already passed away. Now, this servant, in his beauty, in his delicacy, his knowledge and wisdom, reminds us of Alcyone. Alcyone in the book Renunciation by Emmanuel through Chico Xavier. She at some point also worked for her father as a servant, and she too was so beautifully evolved. And of course, she was an evolved spirit, and that's why she displayed those features. And this is also the case with the servant we're talking about today. So he had passed away. So then later on, we got the idea to evoke the young man, Allan Kardec tells us, and this is what he told us. And now let's see. During my next to last incarnation, he says, so not the last incarnation when he was a servant, but the one that was before his servant incarnation, I was from an upstanding family, as they say on earth. However, my father squandered our assets in his extravagance. I was orphaned while very young and had no resources. A friend of my father took me in and raised me as his son, providing me with a good education, from which I derived a little too much vanity. My friend is today Mr. G. So remember, we started off the chapter saying that our servant was part of a noble family, and that noble family, his master, was Mr. G. Mr. G, in that previous incarnation, was the friend of his father who raised him. So what we're seeing here is how beautifully we always know we're already familiar with spirits that we have, in the very least, a close relationship, but often also if the relationship is not quite that close, like family or bosses and so forth. But in this case, he knew this guy. So this is really interesting. So that friend is today Mr. G, who was his master, in whose service you had seen me during my last life. I wanted to expiate my pride by being born into a servile position, a position of a servant, and where I would have the chance to demonstrate my dedication to my benefactor. The benefactor was his master who raised him in a previous incarnation. I even saved his life without his ever having known about it. Beautiful. Let us pause just for a moment, because once again, and this is almost a continuous thread going through the cases we've been studying for almost a year and a half now, and that is that the spirits who have a harder time during their life, afterlife, during their spirit life, have had issues with vanity and pride, with selfishness and pride. And we're not surprised, because Allan Kardec was wondering about that. He actually, in question 913, asked the spirits on high, of all the vices, which lies at the root of them all? So what is the main vice that we're all afflicted with on planet Earth? Which vice is the root of all the vices? We know when we go online, we can actually download pages and pages of vices. But here we learn what is the root. And we learn it's selfishness. The answer is selfishness. Selfishness is all evil derives from it. All evil derives from selfishness. Wow. So what feeds selfishness? When we go to the Gospel according to Spiritism, we learn who the parent of selfishness is. The parent of selfishness is pride. Pride feeds selfishness. So selfishness and pride, one can imagine a coin like a quarter. On one page, on one side is selfishness, and on the other one is pride. but it's actually pride that feeds selfishness. And when we are very selfish and prideful, what are we focusing on? What are we blanking out? Well, we're focusing most and foremost on our material life, on our life in the flesh. And what we're blanking out is our spirit life, the fact that we're actually spirits in this garment, which is this body here, that this is a transitory situation and position we're in. But if we blank all of that out and all we see is our material existence, and we compare and we need to be better and we need to show off, and we have vanity like our friend here, our case, that is when we overemphasize to the point of complete negation of the fact that we're immortal spirits. So let us just, and we know all of this, I know we know, but it's like an invitation again to pay attention in the week to come to see where we still show signs of selfishness and pride. So this is our proposal. Our proposal for homework is to study ourselves, to recommit to our nightly review, to see how have I been doing during this week. Have I been focusing during this particular day? Because the nightly review is at the end of the day, where we go over our days and see where our predominant thought forms or dwelled, and what we were saying, how our speech was, and how we acted, how did we treat other people. And in that, we can put the lens on to see how selfish and prideful we were. All right, friends, let us continue. So he wanted to expiate his pride. So this is what happens very often. In the last 2 weeks, we had 2 cases of beggars, and both of these beggars had higher positions in previous incarnations. And because they were abusing their power, their selfishness and pride and vanity, all the same similar issues, they ultimately decided they wanted to go back into the flesh and expiate their pride, their selfishness, their vanity. And this is the same with the servant. And we don't want to revisit that scene, do we? This is our lifetime. We know better, right? So he wanted to go back and expiate his pride by being born into a servile position. So now he wanted to be a servant, so that he would actually feel how it feels like to be more at the bottom of the totem pole in society, as far as society and material life is concerned. I even saved his life. Okay, we said that. I had enough strength not to allow myself to become corrupted by contact with an almost always corrupting environment. So he lived in an environment that invited him to be corrupt. Despite bad examples, I remain pure, and I give thanks to God, for I have been rewarded with the happiness that I now enjoy. Now, how did he manage to not get corrupted? What do you think? What do you think was the main ingredient for him to not go down the road of becoming a corrupt human being? Because that's always the fork in the road, right? We're surrounded by parents who are corrupt, not very elevated, and we have a choice. We can either go down the road and follow our parents, or we can actually use our parents, and our parents are just an example. There's, of course, society. There's many different other impacts and influences we have. I'm just picking one example. Or we can use our parents as a guidepost of how not to be in those certain areas that are corrupt. But that takes a lot of strength, as he says. And where do we derive the strength from? Well, one really important aspect is our will. Why is it our will? Well, when we go to Thought and Life, this beautiful book by Emmanuel, chapter 2, after chapter 1, where Emmanuel teaches us that the mind stands as the mirror of life. In other words, the mirror, what we're emitting, we're attracting. What we're thinking and we're emitting, we're attracting. So if we look around our life, it's basically a reflection of our thoughts and our feelings. Now, when we go to chapter 2, Emmanuel instantly brings us in touch with the will. And what does he say? He explains it beautifully so we can really understand it and keep it in mind. He says, wrong chapter. We can compare the human mind to a large office subdivided into several departments. So our mind is like a big office building or a big office. And we know that every corporation has many different departments, and our mind does too. So Emmanuel gives us some examples. He says we have the Department of Intelligence, we have the Department of Imagination, we have the Department of Memory, and many more. But we also have the will, the cabinet of the will. And the cabinet of the will is the most important part because it is really the manager of all the other departments that we carry in our mind. So the will is in charge. He says, the will is the decisive factor. It guides the spirit in its pilgrimage to reach the supreme goals outlined by the divine plan. So the will is the one that sends us on the right road. Potentially, but potentially it doesn't. And see, and that's what the interesting piece is. So here our friend had the invitation to become corrupt, but his willpower knew better to not get him down this road. So here is how Emmanuel ends the chapter, which ties us beautifully into the case of our servant. He says, of course, the will cannot stop mental reflections whenever these are produced by contacts with others, because attunement is an unbreakable law. Wow, that sounds for a moment, it stands in contrast to what our friend in heaven and hell has experienced. But Emmanuel continues. So in other words, Emmanuel just says here in the sentence that the law of attunement is unbreakable. So the will has a hard time. It cannot stop mental reflections whenever these are produced by contacts with others. Because why? Because we're always under the influence of other people's minds, not people's, just spirits, incarnates and discarnates, minds and their feelings. As we emit, we're sending it out to, on both realms, we need to wear bifocal lenses like me. In the spirit realm and on planet Earth, we're sending out seeds. And by that, we connect ourselves to incarnates and discarnates. And then the reverse is true too, because all the discarnates and incarnates also sending us the same information, seeds, through their thinking and their feelings. So we're constantly under the influence of others' minds in both realms. But it can impose, the will can impose disciplinary, now we got it, disciplinary control over the elements it governs, so as to maintain them cohesive in the service of goodness. So while the law of attunement is unbreakable, we can't ignore it, but it's still there. It's just like the law of what's the laws blanking right now? The law of gravity. So we can completely ignore the law of gravity and argue about it. But if I have this pencil in my hand, it drops. Because why? Because of gravity. Same is with the law of attunement. But the will can impose disciplinary control over the elements it governs so as to maintain them cohesive in the service of goodness. And this is exactly what happened to our servant. He was evolved enough, wise enough to know better. So he did not surrender to the invitation to become corrupt. He used the wisdom, his will, that was already educated enough to steer him away. even though we know that the law of attunement is unbreakable. So that's pretty notable. That's really something to keep in mind. And the same thing is true for us. So if we educate our mind towards goodness, if we educate our will towards goodness, as Emmanuel tells us in chapter 10, and we've heard it many times, if we visualize goodness in everything and everybody, and if we feel goodness in everything and everybody, and we mold goodness in everything, and every moment of the day, our focus is always in goodwill and goodness, then we have a good chance. Because then that's what we're emitting, and then that will come back to us, and that will help the whole planet in its evolution as well, and also in the spirit world. So it's wonderful. It's really very powerful if we only focus our will on goodness. Let me say hi to Luke. Hello, dear friend, and Flavia, Carol Correa. Thank you so much. And hi to Lima Norbasil. Thank you, friends, for joining. It's lovely to be here with you. So let us see. Let us continue with the servant. So why did you die so young? He's now being asked. And the answer is, God deemed my trial to have been sufficient. So this is a very short answer to a very short, brief, yet poignant question. Because often we wonder, why do people discarnate when they're still very young? And we have to have faith. We're invited to have faith. And it's being confirmed here in this case that nobody dies without a reason. Most often in natural cause, natural deaths, it is because we have completed our incarnatory plan. We are, as he says, God deemed our trial to be sufficient, to be complete. So that is humbling us to surrender ourselves to goodwill and to acknowledge that, and not to become rebellious when it comes to friends or family members who discarnate young, and we become very obstinate to that. So, but here we see, so he is surrendered to that. He says it was enough. God thought this, I've done my work. And then the next question comes, how could you have profited from such a trial if you had no remembrance of the cause that motivated it? So how could he have profited from his trial being a servant if he had no memory of his previous life where he abused vanity and pride? Good question, right? Because often people say, if I only knew who I was in a previous incarnation, everything would be so much better. My life would be easier. I would know what to do, and so forth and so on. But now let us see. So he says, in my humble condition, I still retained an intuition. So this is important, of my former pride. I am quite happy at having been able to control it, a fact that made the trial profitable to me. Otherwise, I would have to go through it all over again. During its moments of freedom, my spirit remembered, and upon awakening, it retained an intuitive desire to resist the inclinations. I earned more merit struggling in this way than I had clearly remembered my past life. The memory of my former position would have exalted my pride and would have given me trouble, whereas I only had to combat the allurements of my new position. So he's explaining to us that it was actually a gift for him not to remember his previous incarnation of being a more powerful human being, because it allowed him to not feed his inclinations that he still had towards pride. And so he was able to earn through merit and struggle to stay on the path towards goodness, to surrender to his position. That was very humbling. So, but what helped him? What was the main ingredient in him staying on the path there? It was his intuition. So now let us go to the Spirit's book. Allan Kardec has a whole little chapter dedicated to this question of forgetfulness. So it is part of chapter 7, if you like to look it up or take note of it. Part 2 of the Spirit's book, and it's in the bigger chapter called The Return to Corporeal Life. And there's a subchapter called Forgetfulness of the Past, and it's question 392. And Allan Kardec is wondering, why does the incarnate spirit lose the memory of its past? Why do we do that? Answer: human beings cannot and must not know everything. All right, good. So we're now feeling a little more humble, and that's good. God, out of divine wisdom, rules it to be this way, that we don't know everything. Without the veil that hides certain things from us, we would be dazzled, like one who passes suddenly from the darkness into the light. By forgetting their past, so our past, we are more fully themselves in the present. And that makes sense, right? If we imagine, if I knew who, let's say, my father was in a previous incarnation, let's assume he was my lover. Oh my gosh, I mean, that would be pretty much sidetracking me, right? I wouldn't be able to be as focused on him as my father in this lifetime if I knew that we were lovers in a previous lifetime, because I would always run that programming from the previous lifetime, and it would distract me. So that's just one example. So then in question 393, Allan Kardec says, how can individuals be responsible for their deeds and redeem their wrongs if they cannot remember them? Like our friend, right? Allan Kardec was wondering, how did you do it? So how can individuals be responsible for their deeds and redeem their wrongs if they cannot remember them from previous incarnations? How can they profit from the experience acquired in lives that have fallen into forgottenness? We could understand that life's tribulations might be a lesson for them if they could remember what had caused them in the first place. But since they do not remember them at all, each existence is as if it were the first. And it is thus that they're always having to start over. True, right? How can this be reconciled with the justice of God, that we completely are reborn not remembering anything, most of us anyway, just starting all over, like we appear to be blank slates. We're not, of course, but it's all forgotten. So how does that help us, right? So here's the answer. With each new existence, spirits gain more intelligence and can better distinguish between good and evil. Where would their merit, see, here's the word merit again, because our friend said he had the merit of doing it better this time. Where would their merit be if they remembered their entire past? When spirits enter their life of origin, meaning the spirit life, the entire previous life unfolds before them. So when we discarnate, most often our whole entire previous life appears in front of us. We all of a sudden see a little bit more and better. They see the wrongs they committed and which are the cause of their suffering, as well as what would have kept them from committing them in the first place. So we're getting an overview. They understand the justice of the position assigned to them, and they thus desire a new existence that can redeem the one that has elapsed. And we've seen that throughout the cases that we've studied. And we've seen it also in Memoirs of a Suicide, how after a while of education and support and help in the spirit during this the life in the spirit life, for spirit in the spirit life, spirits learn and understand what they have done wrong in a new way. And it often happens because they experience excruciating pain as a result of the wrongs they've committed in a previous incarnation. And then at some point, the pain becomes so unbearable that they humble themselves. And the first step is usually a prayer. It's a call for God, humbling to surrender to God. And that's remorse. And at that very moment, help usually comes. But this is what they're talking about here. They understand the justice now of the position assigned to them, and then the desire for a new lifetime comes to expiate the wrongs from the previous incarnation. They seek the trials similar to those they have already experienced, or struggles they believe will be appropriate for their advancement, like our friend who, in this case, came back to the same people, but this time not as someone who is in charge, but as the one who is the servant. Same happened in the two other cases in the last 2 weeks who were beggars. They came right back to the same area with the same people. One was a castle last week, and they were beggars at the very castle where they used to be lords. They ask spirits who are of a higher order to help them in the new task that they are about to undertake, for they know that the spirit who will be given to them as their guide in that new existence will endeavor to enable them to repair their wrongs of the past by giving them a sort of intuition about them. So we know we have our spirit guide, and we have also other spirits surrounding us. There's familiar spirits, there's spirits who want to help us, and of course spirits that we attracted to the law of attunement. But there is spirits, as we're learning here, that are surrounding us from incarnation, from the beginning to the incarnation, and they helping us repair our wrongs from a previous life. And that's why we have this sense of intuition of which way to turn and what to choose. The same intuition is the thought, the wrongful desire, which frequently assaults you and which you instinctively resist, exactly like our friend here, right? He was surrounded by corruption, but it's this friendly voice, it's our spirit guide, it's our mentor who is helping us to stay aligned. And it comes through as our feelings of intuition, like a voice. Sometimes we hear a voice. However, it is the voice of conscience speaking to you, and this voice is a memory of the past, a voice that warns you not to fall into the errors you committed previously. In that new existence, if a spirit endures its trials with courage and resists them, it evolves and will ascend in the spirit's hierarchy when it returns to be among them. It's beautiful. The small print is, if during our corporeal life we do not have a precise memory of what we were and of what good or bad things we did in our previous lifetimes, we nevertheless have an intuition of them. Hence, our instinctive tendencies are a reminiscence of our past, about which our conscience warns us that we must resist. So when we know thyself, right? We know that that's the first step, very important step for us, for our inner transformation. We need to get to know ourselves. And what will help us, part of that process is our nightly review. It's observing our tendencies, because these tendencies are a clue as to where we've been in a previous incarnation, and the intuition that will guide us, hopefully staying on course, observing our tendencies and not surrendering to the old, but always towards goodness. What a beautiful invitation. This is really at the core of this case, because this case is really teaching us of how to observe our tendencies, of how to learn to listen to our intuition, and to build up merit, to do it out of our own willpower, to engage our will towards goodness so we can have a successful incarnation. This lifetime is our opportunity. We're gifted to have spiritism in our lives. So essentially, we have no more excuse. All right. I want to just add a couple of sentences here. In the forgetfulness of past existences, especially when they were painful, is there not something providential where the divine wisdom is revealed? It feels like it, right? We know it is. Is It is on the more highly evolved worlds. Oh no. The remembrance of our former personalities would entail serious inconveniences. In certain cases, it would cause us a great deal of humiliation. Just imagine if I knew I was a murderer in a previous incarnation. I would feel terrible the whole entire time. I know I wasn't a saint and I did a lot of things wrong for sure, but not knowing exactly my terrible past definitely helps, doesn't it? It gives us it keeps us more present. And then in other cases, so in certain cases, it would be a humiliation. In others, it could exalt our pride and so hinder our free will. God has given us just what is necessary and sufficient for us to improve ourselves. God is good, and it feels good. And thank you, God, for being so wise. So, dear friends, we are in the right place at the right time, surrounded by the right people, perfect for our expiatory path we're on. So let us go back to our friend here. So next question is, what good was the brilliant education you had received during your next to last incarnation? Remember, his parents had died, and a friend of his father took him in and gave him a brilliant education. And so then he came back as a servant. And now the question is, so how did that serve you? You were a servant and you had this brilliant education. You didn't make use of it. So how does that all fit together, right? So let's see. He says, such knowledge would have been useless, even nonsensical in my new position. So he didn't need it to be a servant. It remained latent, and I have not regained it. So he's not in touch with it. It stayed latent, hidden from him. Nonetheless, that knowledge was not completely useless because it helped my intelligence develop. It instinctively had a predilection for, I instinctively had a predilection for elevated things. Predilection means like he was drawn to elevated things, which inspired me with repugnance for the low and ignoble examples I had before me. So see, the knowledge that he had acquired helped him also to stay on course and not surrender to the corruptness that he was surrounded with. Without that education, I would have been nothing more than a servant. So we need to keep in mind that we are spirits on this reincarnatory path. For millennia, we've gone from lifetime to lifetime. Why? In order to perfect ourselves. To perfect ourselves in two different realms. And Emmanuel helps us again in Thought and Life to understand that in the chapter on education, instruction actually. He tells us that we humans are like birds. We have two wings. And these two wings need to be equally developed for us to ascend to God. Because we're on our path to get closer to God. We have God's seed in us. And hopefully we're watering and nourishing it every single day by doing the good. So the two wings, one is service and the other one is wisdom. So let's just see. Where is that piece of paper? I wanted to, oh well, here it is. We have it here in the book. It is chapter, It's chapter, just a second, 4, and it's called instruction. So we have love and wisdom. That's what Emmanuel tells us. Wisdom is linked to knowledge. It's linked to education. It's linked to studying. It's linked to intelligence, instruction. It is that side that was nourished in our servant in the incarnation before he was a servant. And it's one of our wings that we need to develop. Now on planet Earth, that wing is on the whole a little more strongly developed. There's another wing, and that is the love wing. That's the one where we serve, where we make use of our knowledge towards the good. We're turning the mirror of our soul and connecting with God, and we're aligning our will with God's will to do the good, to serve, to be charitable, to love. See, those are the two wings. And as we develop those two wings, we slowly but surely get closer to God, like a bird swinging our wings and getting closer and closer to God. Now, in this particular case, we're seeing so beautifully how the instruction, even though the study he'd done, his education he received, didn't help in that particular incarnation, but it steered him towards refinement. It helped him to stay away from the crudeness of the environment he was surrounded with, the corruption. It's beautiful, isn't it? So studying, education is never lost. Never. It will always help us, even if we feel like, why did I go to college? And why did I study that? I made no use of it in this lifetime. No, it forms our brain. It creates pathways in our brain that we can use. And if it's not in this lifetime, it stays with us. It's part of nourishing our immortal part. It will always stay with us. So let's see. Are the examples of selfless devotion of servants towards their masters the result of previous relationships? Good question, right? So is the selfless devotion of servants towards their masters the result of previous relationships they had? Because we know that these two did have a relationship, because his master, when he was a servant, was the friend, his father's friend who raised him in the previous incarnation. Answer is, have no doubt about it, for such is usually the case. Beautiful. So we've learned it. So the reason why servants are devoted to their masters is usually because they've had a previous relationship. They know each other. One has benefited from the other, and the servant most likely, or very likely, needs to work on the selfishness and pride aspect in that particular lifetime. How beautiful, huh? So sometimes such servants even used to be members of the same family, or, as in my case, duty-bound persons who pay a debt of gratitude and whose dedication helps them to advance. What an invitation for us to never judge people. And I'm only picking that example because we're more prone to judging people in lower societal positions. But we're once again invited to not judge, because we have no idea of what went before that snapshot that our mind takes and then wants to go running in terms of judgment, right? Go running with it and forms judgments. No. If anything, let us just send them love. Anyone, always, just seeing the goodness in it all and having faith and trust. God knows there's a good reason for everything. If we focus on doing the good, there's no time to judge those relationships, right, friends? You do not know all the effects of sympathy or antipathy that these previous relationships produce in the world. And it's so true. That's what we just said. We don't know. So why judge? Why judge? Really, right? We're not born judges. We were reborn, and we're here to work on our inner transformation and doing the good, to be of service, to strengthen those two wings of education, of wisdom and love. No, death does not interrupt such relationships, which often last from century to century. Why are such examples of dedication from servants so rare nowadays? Blame the selfish and prideful spirit of your time. Aggravated by incredulity and materialistic ideas, true faith departs when faced with cupidity and the desire for material gain. And when faith departs, so does devotion. By leading people to the truth, Spiritism will revive forgotten virtues. And we know that The antidote to selfishness and pride is what? It's charity. And charity is defined by the spirits on high as goodwill towards all. Now that's all with all capital letters. That's all. There is no exceptions. There is not just this person, but then, nah, not that one. This every family member. It's every one of our friends. It's every one of our co-workers. It's every one of our neighbors. We have to have goodwill. Willing the good, seeing the good in all. And everyone has always something good. And if we can just focus on that, and it opens our hearts, and prayer always helps. So the definition is goodwill towards all. It's indulgence towards others' imperfections. And it is forgiving others' offenses. Because we can only be forgiven to the degree we forgive. So that puts us on our toes, because the minute we feel insulted, we know we have insulted. So let us forgive and forget, because we know we need it. We need it badly. We need forgiveness badly. So practicing charity is part of doing goodness. And prayer is a form of charity as well. So he ends the chapter by saying, there is nothing better than this example of our servant to demonstrate the benefits of forgetting one's former existences. If Mr. G, who was his master, had remembered who his servant had been formerly, he would have felt very uncomfortable and would not have kept him in his position. He would have hampered the trial that ended up being advantageous to both of them. How true is that? It really shows to us this case. And thank you, Allan Kardec. And thank you for our servant to be willing to cooperate and show us this beautiful lesson of how the forgetfulness of our past is so beneficial for us, because it keeps us present and it allows us to work on our lessons that we have signed up to learn in this lifetime. It helps us to build up merit, to learn the lesson steeped in merit. And it allows us to connect with our relationships, the people who are in our lives, in a cleaner, more present way. Because as we see, Mr. G would likely not have hired the servant he did had he known what their relationships would have been like. And consequently, he would have not had the opportunity to learn his lesson. So thank you, God, for allowing us forgetfulness of our past. So, dear friends, let us close our eyes, and we'll be bringing in Mother Mary for a moment, for a little background music, to open our hearts a little bit more. And let us do our closing prayer. Dear God, we are so grateful for your divine providence, for your love, for your care, for your support, for your amazing organization of this universe, your perfection. We're so grateful for this lesson tonight, to understand in a renewed, clearer way of why it is such a gift you give us to forget our past, that we come into each and every incarnation open-minded, so to speak, yet having our intuition, our conscience, and the ability to observe our tendencies to know which lessons we need to learn. And if we are confused right now, we know our mentors and helper spirits will help us. All we need to do is reach out, recommit to our nightly review, and start studying our tendencies to get to know ourselves better. so we can have a better experience in this lifetime, learning our lessons more effectively. Thank you also for reminding us to strengthen both of our wings to get closer to God, to study and to practice love. Thank you for allowing us to recommit to this as well, and understanding that when new opportunities of study come into our lives, to never turn them down, as we can only ascend to God by perfecting ourselves. And we thank you also to offer to us always new opportunities of service. And we know every service comes our way for a good reason, and we will accept it lovingly and with gratitude, as we are dedicated to learning to become more charitable in our everyday life. And we're sending our love to all those who are surrounding us, and further on, we're sending it to the governments of all the different countries. We're sending it to discarnate spirits who are having so much influence on our incarnate friends and our own selves. Let us pray for all, so we can be more accepting, indulgent, benevolent, and forgiving. With so much gratitude in our hearts for this beautiful lesson tonight, we ask for permission to close our study. And so be it. Thank you, dear friends. Thank you, Victoria, Adele, Nora, Franklin, Luke, Flavia, Carol, and Heider. I think in this, there may be more friends and I don't see more yet. If I didn't mention your name, please feel hugged. And so God willing, we will meet again next week, same time, same place, with another case of our Earthly Expiations from Heaven and Hell by Allan Kardec. God bless you. Good night.